All right, so today we're going to finish up our unit on cellular respiration. We've been looking at aerobic cellular respiration so far, of course, meaning that oxygen was present. But what if oxygen isn't present? What if you're exercising intensely and you can't get enough oxygen to your muscles? Those muscles still need energy, and so do those cells. There is another process that can take place. It's called anaerobic respiration or fermentation. You're not going to get the kind of quantity of ATP that are going to be produced. And if you're exercising, you may end up with a little cramping, but it will keep hopefully those cells going. So let's look at this process. Fermentation or anaerobic respiration actually takes place in the cytoplasm. Basically, it's just like glycolysis running over and over again. What will happen is that NADH that does not go into the mitochondria because there's no oxygen present will kick back into glycolysis, and we'll drop those H's off and release them so that we can power glycolysis again. No more ATP is going to be made. The reaction is basically powered just to sustain itself. Because remember, it's a 2 ATP investment to get glycolysis going. So if you only have a net gain in glycolysis of 2 ATP, those ATP are going to go right back in. So fermentation is really about just sustaining this process. The hydrogens that are released are going to be picked up to create new molecules, and depending on the type of fermentation, you can get things like lactic acid, ethanol. So there's a lot of different things that can occur depending on the type of pathway that the fermentation takes. So this is what fermentation looks like. You can see the glucose, the process breaking down the glycolysis just like it normally does, creating the pyruvate, but the problem is there's no oxygen present. So what will happen is that pyruvate will be kicked back, and depending on the type of fermentation taking place will determine the types of products. Now remember, the pyruvate is a special molecule. Basically, it's the glucose cut in half. It's C3H4O3. Now remember, a couple of those hydrogens are given off into those NADHs. That's why that number looks a little different than if you actually literally cut the glucose in half. But in fermentation, remember what's going to happen is that NADH that was going to go to the electron transport chain is now actually broken back down into NAD. And those hydrogens are replaced back in to create some new molecules. In the case of lactic acid fermentations, which what happens in our muscles, those two hydrogen molecules are going to be added back in to create lactic acid. And lactic acid, the formula for lactic acid looks like this, C3H6O3. So you can see the hydrogens have been added back in. And so lactic acid will be created during that type of fermentation. And now if that's occurring in your muscles, that lactic acid is going to build up. And that lactic acid is what causes that cramping in your calves and your quads and stuff when your abdomen area when you're exercising real hard, because that acid is building up. And that pathway of normal aerobic respiration is not really occurring enough. That's why it's important if you're an athlete to be conditioned. That lactic acid, when it builds up, you're in trouble, and it's got to be gotten rid of. And there's only really basically one way to get rid of it, which I'll mention in a second. Now, if we're talking about alcoholic fermentation, like maybe with yeast, we're talking about something else being produced, like ethanol. Ethanol is a little bit different because during that process of fermentation, it's kind of hard to see. I guess you can see it over. You can see one of the products is carbon dioxide gas. Like when yeast is rising, it's that carbon dioxide gas that makes the yeast rise. That's why you see all those pockets in your bread and stuff. So some of that carbon is being given off to the CO2, and you're also going to end up with ethanol, which looks like the C2H6O. So you can see a couple of those oxygens were given to the CO2. Carbon was given to the CO2, and you can see those H's in there from the NADH. So you're getting different products, but basically they're both kind of the similar pathway in that they're occurring in the cytoplasm or the cytosol, because remember, glycolysis does not require oxygen. So this process can kind of run, but it's not going to sustain you. Like, for example, if you're doing some kind of strenuous aerobic exercise, this is kind of emergency stuff for you. This is what it looks like if you were to take a look at the diagram in your textbook. You can see the same process, alcoholic fermentation producing those carbon dioxide molecules. You can see two of them because one from each pyruvate molecule. You can see here lactic acid. That lactic acid, of course, building up in your muscles, causing all that painful cramping. So basically, you can see this process is just a glycolysis powering itself over and over again. That's what that terrible circle is. And you can see you're not really getting an ATP because the ATP is being consumed back in to power the glycolysis to sustain it. Now, what if you did have all that lactic acid buildup? What are you going to do about it? Okay, lactic acid buildup has to be repaid through an oxygen payback. That's why a lot of times you see athletes, like for example, the Dolphins go to Denver to Mile High Stadium. They're not used to that lack of oxygen up there. Their bodies are not conditioned for it. So a lot of times you'll be seeing them on the sideline. They're cramping up. They're sucking oxygen, trying to get oxygen back into their bloodstream to help power that aerobic respiration that they need to be able to play. Okay, now, aerobic and anaerobic respiration are not, they're different things, but there are aerobic exercise, they're anaerobic exercise. One is not, better than the other. They're different types depending on the type of sport you play. Some are very aerobic, like soccer and basketball, maybe lacrosse, these kind of sports that are sustaining a higher elevated heart rate, maybe, cross country, those kind of things. And they require a lot of ATP, and they require a lot of oxygen. That's why you have to be conditioned. You have to train to run a marathon, to be a cross-country runner. You have to train and practice to play soccer. So you have, your body is accustomed to that, and you can efficiently move oxygen to the cells. And of course, have good meals beforehand, plenty of glucose, so you have your carbs to power your respiration. Some sports don't necessarily require that kind of aerobic contribution. Say you're a sprinter or weightlifter, those are anaerobic. They're very quick. They require a huge amount of ATP really fast, and then they're done. So that concludes our section on fermentation, and also closes our unit out on cellular respiration. Don't forget, in your assignments, I also included the BioFlix video from the textbook, which has all the process of cellular respiration, aerobic cellular respiration, that is. So you can watch that and review it. And don't forget, on Tuesday morning, we have our review at 7:30 a.m. if you're interested in coming.